So I've been obviously following the latest developments in in Cuba to the extent that that's possible for somebody as just an outside observer in the U.S. And I happened to go yesterday to this rally in Hudson County, New Jersey, which is a big enclave of Cuban Americans. I think it may actually be the most populated enclave of Cuban Americans um, outside South Florida.
Yeah, a lot of Cubans got resettled to New Jersey
Yeah,
a while ago.
yeah, and so there was this almost impromptu rally. I think it was organized in less than a day. In It started in North Bergen, and then we marched down to West New York, and I was pretty fascinated by it for a number of reasons. Number one, the attendees, and I don't even say this in a pejorative way, were extremely rabid. That's the only word I can use that comes to mind. Meaning, passionate, enthusiastic, and it took place almost entirely in Spanish, except for the handful of gringo politicians who spoke, including the mayors of those cities who are, and this is a Democratic stronghold, by the way. So it's a little bit different than South Florida, where Cuban Americans are more reliably Republican, or at least that's the caricature anyway. But I think it's borne out in the voting data. But this is definitely a more heavily Democratic area. And so you had three or four Democratic mayors of North Bergen, West New York, Guttenberg, and Union City organizing almost overnight this Cuba liberation rally, kind of very similar to what we've seen in South Florida. And I got a chance to speak to one of the organizers, this longtime Democratic Party power broker in Hudson County, Brian Stack, who, luckily enough for him, is actually simultaneously the mayor of Union City and a state senator. He's grandfathered in to be allowed to do that because the practice in New Jersey was outlawed in 2008 of double dipping. But it means that he can entrench a lot of political cachet and sway. And so, and another state senator / mayor, also Nicholas Sacco, who's the mayor of North Bergen, is in a similar position essentially in New York Democratic Party politics. And so you had these Democratic. This is a heavily Democratic area, heavily Cuban, but mixed with different Latin people, and conducted almost entirely in Spanish. And although I did take rudimentary Spanish in school, I'm not fluent in it, so a lot of it I couldn't even really follow, frankly.
Yeah, next time invite me along. I'll be your translator.
Okay, yeah.
Yeah, I'm in New York.
Oh, okay. Yeah, I mean, actually, there was a New York City contingent who came over to this rally. I should really, by the way, follow through on my longtime goal of becoming at least conversant in Spanish. That would have been journalistically helpful. Yes, last night. And a lot, and I'm not, without exaggeration, I queried amongst the people who could understand a little bit of English or who spoke fluent English. It was kind of, it varied. Everybody I asked, every participant in the rally, explicitly wanted U.S. military intervention in Cuba. Yeah. So I didn't cherry pick. I didn't try to exaggerate. I don't like to do that in general, whatever the topic is that I'm covering. A randomly selected sample of 15 or 20 people. Every single person I asked, except one woman. So there was one woman who didn't want U.S. intervention, but she was still in support of the overall spirit of the rally. They wanted U.S. military intervention. I thought to myself, whoa. Look, I knew that the Cuban population in the U.S. Can have some, let's say, hardline views about the current government in Cuba and want to, want the U.S. to take policy steps to change the situation there. But I wouldn't necessarily have anticipated that there would be such a universal desire for military intervention. One of this mayor of Union City, Brian Stack, he actually overtly called for an invasion. And this is sorry if I'm going on a little bit, but just to set the stage.
Yeah.
This is pretty important because I don't know if there's a mass constituency amongst non-Cubans for a military intervention of any kind in Cuba.
I don't believe there is.
No, there isn't. But there are pockets of extremely politically engaged demographics who do want it, and it's particularly important vis-a-vis New Jersey because Senator Bob Menendez, Cuban American,
he holds the keys.
Yeah, he's the chairman of the Senate Foreign Relations Committee, and he's from Union City, essentially. He was the mayor of Union City. And so his successor, who's a white guy, is calling for a U.S. military invasion. So as far as I could tell, and I sent a query to Menendez's office today, haven't gotten a reply back yet, but I don't believe that he's gone so far as to endorse a military intervention. But his constituents and his kind of political milieu are pretty ardently calling for it. So who knows what could happen? I mean, I don't think it's likely. But that's sort of that would be a key factor, I think, in influencing the Biden administration were Menendez to come out in favor of this as a result of the clamoring for it in his political power base, essentially. And so that's why I today I was getting a little bit more immersed in the issue. I'm writing a Substack on this, like I said, for tomorrow. And I just hadn't felt like I got any information on the current protest, the current unrest, whatever you want to call it, that is remotely impartial. Not to say that you have to, have some sterling impartiality to provide reliable or useful information about a geopolitical issue, but a lot of the information being funneled down to the U.S. consciousness on the subject is through a pretty concerted campaign by emigres to demand U.S. military intervention. So that I think is some reason for a little bit of caution. And you had a piece in Medium that you sent me that I thought did a really good job in presenting an even-handed accounting of what's going on. So if you want to react to anything I said there, and then just go on to maybe just outline the basic argument or the basic gist behind what you wrote in Medium, and that'll be linked in the description box also.
Sure. So starting with your first point, which was Menendez, right? And the Biden administration and what they could react to. So from everything I've seen about the Biden administration, including their campaign against their opponents, they're pretty lethargic, right? Like the Biden administration is slow to react. They were slow to stay away from any online fights. They were basically thinking they were going to be coronated regardless. So they always take their time and choose sort of the path of least resistance whenever anything comes. Now, from what I heard about Menendez, his first statement was that he wasn't in favor of any sort of intervention or anything like that. It's just more of the, we support democracy around the world. We support the Cuban people. So many words. I don't think that there's anything you can do to make the Biden administration change their course, which will be the path of least resistance. It's going to be basically doing nothing, because doing something would be difficult, right? There was just a UN vote that happened, 184-2, condemning the embargo. The only two people that voted in favor of the embargo were the United States and Israel, who is more or less a sort of a client state of the United States.
Which is, so just to interject real quick, which is pretty ironic, right? Because a lot of the rhetoric now you're seeing about why the U.S. and the world should pay attention to this issue is because there needs to be some international engagement. And yet there is international engagement in a formal setting at the UN, and the U.S. is one of only 2 countries, along with the Klein state, that opposes this resolution to remove the embargo. So
when you take an L that big, when you take an 184-2 loss, you need to start, looking within yourself to see what you're doing wrong. So I don't think the Biden administration is going to do anything about this. I think they will continue to lose Florida in the future. Do they have an opportunity here to reverse course and do something military? Doesn't have to be boots on ground, right? It could be something like, let's say, opening up Guantanamo Bay and arming protesters, because no protesters in Cuba have weapons. They're illegal. They're banned. So something like that. I don't think that's going to happen. That's a choice they would have. I'm not saying.
So in Cuba, there's a universal ban on
I'm
like
gun
firearms
on gun ownership, more or less. The Cuban people.
Is there any kind of black? There must be some kind of black market for weaponry.
I mean, you have like old rifles out in the countryside, right? Like single shot things for like hunting and stuff, but you don't have any weapons. And Cuba has no gun crime. Cuba has very little crime to begin with. Most of that crime is, fighting or knife crime or somebody breaking a bottle. But gun crime is it is an unarmed population. People do not have guns. The ones they have are extremely old and have been in the closet for years. And they're, sort of like from the 60s and 50s.
Probably like some Soviet rifles floating around somewhere.
Old shit. That's, and the population is not armed. So their chances of succeeding, if the Cuban government decide, if the protests do proceed and they go violent, that's the worst guy right there. That's the worst guy making it with the fucking bicycle.
I mean, when I live in an apartment overlooking a major thoroughfare in Jersey City, so there's not much I can do about that kind of background.
So do I, so you might hear that on my side. So I don't think the Biden administration is going to do anything, though I'm sure they're doing their own internal calculations. But the people who design democratic policies toward Cuba are very much part of the Obama milieu. And those people are by their very nature pragmatic, diplomatic, and economic, right? There's an idea that if you open up Cuba slowly through diplomacy and through letting a hotel or two being established there, that it's sort of a Trojan horse. And little by little, the island will be forced to economically liberalize, which will inevitably lead to political liberalization. Yeah. Whether that works, it can, it might not, it will, who knows? But those are the people advising Biden on this. And so I don't think there's going to be any type of movement when it comes to that.
Yeah. So what is your, so I'm getting a little bit of feedback on your end.
All right. I fixed it, I think.
Okay. What is your, what's your thought on what seems to be, at least among the most energized kind of activists, if you can call them that, a pretty uniform sentiment for some sort of actual military intervention? Is that what you would have expected from these protesters who, even in Miami, are going so far as to shut down highways?
Yeah. Well, 100%. I mean, it's sort of an interesting history that Cuba, and particularly Cubans in Miami, have with the regime. So the first wave of immigrants, right, or emigres, as you might call them, were coming out of the revolution in 1959. And those were people who were either in the Batista camp or weren't, Batista, the dictator of Cuba at that time, who were in that camp or weren't. They were just the political opposition, now driven out by the new Castro government, or people who had significant property and caught a whiff of socialism or communism or whatever. That's the first camp that came. And they sort of set the table by, joining different CIA movements, having the Bay of Pigs invasion. To this day, there's an active hatred of the Kennedys. They blame him for the abandonment, for not providing sufficient air support, et cetera, in Bay of Pigs. That was the first wave. And they were a violent lot. This has sort of been forgotten, but during the 70s and 80s, Miami was a violent place, not only because of drugs, but because of politically motivated bombings. There were something like 800 or not 800, hundreds of bombings politically motivated in Miami. If you were a radio station that said, hey guys, we lost, the revolution won, maybe we should move on, you could expect that a bomb would be delivered, at some point to your station. And not a lot of casualties, but a lot of vandalism. Certain figures that were still trying to keep the fight alive after the failure of Bay of Pigs, they got blown up in car bombs, including a guy called Mas Ferrer, who was the captain of Batista's secret police. He died in a car bomb in the 1970s, a week after calling people pendejo, which, like ballless, like cowards, for not supporting terrorist attacks against the regime. So Miami has sort of a dark, violent past with this that gets tamped down in the 90s as a new wave of immigrants comes. And that wave is economic immigrants. They're no longer political. My family included. I came to the United States when I was 9 in 2006. So we're part of that wave that was expected to vote Democrat. The demographics did not trend that way. Obama did win Florida twice, but after a certain point, more and more people kept coming. I think that Cubans feel personally insulted by the regime, and we can get into why that is. But when Trump came along, he was saying openly a lot of things that Cubans wanted to hear. And the second his sanctions began, things in Cuba began to get harder, and they viewed that as proof that Cuba was not going to liberalize, that nothing was going to change, that no promises were going to be met by the communist government. So therefore, it's all-out war. There's no compromise. There's no talking to the regime. Either the regime goes or nothing. And that's sort of the history of Miami when it comes to the politics of violence and invasion. It has always been supported. There's always been an undercurrent active in Miami. And to this day, actually, there are programs which you and I pay for, that we pay with our taxes, things like Radio Marti, right? Which is sort of the Radio Free Europe that broadcasts anti-communist, anti-government stuff into Cuba by planes from Miami, and that's paid for by taxpayer money. So there's always been this undercurrent. Since the Trump sanctions gave them a voice, and things got worse in Cuba as a result of a bunch of things, including the sanctions. Trump is not solely to blame for this in the slightest. They viewed that as evidence that the regime was not going to change, that the regime was not interested in talking, that everything Obama said was, basically a lie. And so the only recourse is intervention. There is no talking to a regime that, in their view, oppresses them for decades and decades.
Yeah.
My own parents, by the way, are pro-intervention. And I know people that have worked in like decently high up Republican campaigns who are pro-intervention. And the thing that I think can sway some people, this is the one thing I can think can sway the Biden administration, is that there have been reports, unconfirmed, of Venezuelan troops landing in Cuba just in case things get really bad. Now, if Venezuelan troops suppress a single Cuban citizen, that's when I think the calculus can change for Democrats and for the Obama administration, because now it's...
for the Biden administration.
The Joe Biden administration. My apologies. Because now I think that's an international throwdown.
So when you say your parents, for example, support intervention, like what specifically do they want? Because I think it's worth trying to press some of these advocates of intervention on the specifics of what they're envisioning. I mean, do they want a ground invasion, airstrikes? Do they want protracted U.S. military occupation? I mean, have they thought it through what that would actually look like?
Sure. I can't speak for my parents about this, but I can speak for the milieu, the people at large, I guess. Anything is on the table, right? They view the regime as on its face illegitimate, and they don't think anything bad can happen. When you try to bring up the point about, transitions and whatnot in the Soviet Union, in other places, they can be quite fraught. The Soviet Union was a hellhole in the 90s, filled with crime, gangsters, and ultimately ended up no better than it used to be. So they that does not register. like I say in my piece, it's deeply personal. They don't believe that there's anything worse than communism. And that is an adoption of sort of a Republican American line. I think there's a word for it. It's the Miami distortion field or something like that. Cubans in Miami are deeply conservative people who have bought into and still keep alive a lot of the Cold War stuff. I'm not saying that's a bad thing for them to do. They actually had to live in communist Cuba, and that's not a nice place to live. I detail in my article how the government insults Cubans, and particularly Cubans abroad, in every single way it can. So their hatred is justified. But everything is on the table. That is an illegitimate communist regime that keeps their families separate. They should be bombed. They should be killed. We should be giving weapons to the Cuban people who are unarmed. And ultimately, I think the end goal, which I think all of them basically would agree with, is that Cuba should become a U.S. state. I think if you did a poll among Republicans who were Cubans, whether if a transition, it would be preferable for Cuba to become a Puerto Rico thing or a U.S. state, that's always been their dream. That dream has existed as far back as the 19th century, Cuba joining the Union.
Thomas Jefferson fantasized about that.
Yeah, Thomas Jefferson fantasized about that. The first revolution to happen in Cuba in the 1860s, actually, their final thing was trying to lobby the United States to join because they wanted to be a state. That was their official position after a while. So this has always existed. It's never died. It's 200 years in the making, and it certainly isn't dying now after an emigre population that feels wronged, mistreated, that has to send money to their family every single month. They feel fleeced. Like, for example, here's an example. I cannot enter Cuba on my American passport. Cuba does not consider me an American citizen. They make me renew a Cuban passport for a few $100s every year. Why is that? I am an American citizen. They do not allow me to revoke my citizenship. Not that I would. They just want more money out of me. So my passport just expired. If I was to go back to Cuba, which I plan on doing this year, that means sending a check to Cuba. And at every single point, the Cubans nickel and dime their exile population while calling them no better than worms, right? That's the word gusano, which you see a lot on, not that Twitter matters, but you see a lot like Marxists.
Well, you say Twitter doesn't matter, but I mean, some of the mayors who organized this this rally yesterday were like wonderstruck that social media is how this event came about with such rapidity. So, I mean, I don't know if it was primarily Twitter, it was probably other platforms, but it may matter to some extent. I mean, you have Marco Rubio tweeting up a storm as usual with the SOS Cuba hashtag. So, I mean, I don't know if it matters or doesn't, but it's worth at least keeping an eye on. But sorry to interrupt.
I agree. No problem. I'm just speaking about online Marxists who have, more of a say online than they do in your politics system. Yeah,
exactly.
Like you voiced an anti-Cuba opinion. There's a good chance that a Marxist is going to show up in your comments and call you a gusano, a worm, which is the word that they have for anti-Cuban people abroad or for people that don't support the regime. I wouldn't go as far to call it a slur, but it's slur territory.